Number 7. Zambia. Across the Zambezi. We're edging into Central Africa, a little more exotic. Zambia, in ways, resembles more the countries of Central Africa than Southern Africa. You'll see what I mean. But Zambia is very like Southern Africa by sitting on the Southern Africa Plateau. The Zambezi River cuts valleys in the south, while in the northeast corner are the ridges and mountains of the East Africa Rift. More on that in East Africa. Zambia is almost entirely savanna. Like Zimbabwe, the Zambezi lowlands are occupied by Mopane woodlands, while the plateau is Miombo woodlands. Further west, in the drier region, Zambia has dry forests, grasslands, and teak savanna. The flat river floodplains have also produced large areas of wetlands. These all give Zambia rich biodiversity. Because of Zambia's elevation, most of the country is subtropical highland, with winter, while the lower Zambezi valleys are tropical, without winter. October to April is the rainy season, May to September the dry. So, since we're heading into Central Africa with this one, allow me to introduce the Batwa. This is a term the Bantu have for Bushmen, maybe even more vaguely for foreigners or others. One twa, multiple Batwa. This word has often been used interchangeably with pygmy, as many have diminutive stature, but I'll reserve pygmy for Aboriginal Congo jungle folk. Instead, for Zambia, the Batwa are the remnants of the original inhabitants of the country. Genetically, they appear to be descended from the same stock as the Khoisan, southern African hunter-gatherers, though also represent a distinct lineage. In their pure form, they probably resembled Khoisan. In their undisturbed state, the Zambian Batwa exploited the bounties of the savannah, but 'twas not meant to last, as around 3,000 years ago the Bantu began migrating into the northern part of the southern African plateau. Once again, our old friends the Bantu overpower the native peoples with their superior numbers and technology. A farming folk, the Bantu settle along rivers. The native Batwa are then pushed into places where farming is difficult. In Zambia's case, it's the many swamps. Thus, a scattering of these aboriginals persist in the Kafwe, Lukanga, and Bangwelu swamps. Here, they form a sort of symbiosis with the Bantu. The Batwa hunt and fish and trade for Bantu grain and manufactured goods. The Batwa even adopt the Bantu languages, while Bantu often carry off Batwa women as brides. The result is a wild folk with mixed ancestry. Now, the Bantu themselves probably first entered the Zambezi watershed from the northeast, through the corridor between lakes Malawi and Tanganyika. After conquering, absorbing, or displacing the native Batwa, the Bantu settled down and began to diverge. The presence of numerous valleys and swamps creates barriers separating Bantu groups. The upper Zambezians emerge above the swamps of western Zambia. The middle Zambezians gather below to the Kafwe Zambezi swamp, and also apparently in the Luapula and Lufira river valleys, which, while part of the wider Congo River, are separated from the Congo Basin by mountains and easier to reach from the Zambezi. They also spread along the southwestern shore of Lake Tanganyika. The lower Zambezians emerge from the Kafwe Zambezi swamp down to the sea. In addition, the Bantu in the East African Rift are more associated with those to the east. I call this group the Southern Lacustrine Bantu. We also have the southwestern Bantu along the Chobe River west of the Lenyanti Swamp, mentioned back in Botswana. And finally, our last group lives in the Congo. This river is vast, and we'll have fun unpacking all the multitudes of peoples in this behemoth of a country. But along the rivers of the upper Kasai and Lualaba, the South Congo group diverges. Alright, this next part took me a while to research and make sense of, so try and keep up as all these groups start breaking into smaller groups. The southwestern Bantu here become the Kavango. The upper Zambezians along the Barotse floodplain become the Luyana. Those northwards are the Luvale. The middle Zambezians split into two groups, the Botatwe along the Zambezi and Kafwe rivers, the Sabi northeast in the Lumsemfwa, Luapula, and Lufira valleys. The lower Zambezians break off into the Chewa in much of the area, while the Tumbuko coalesce in the lower Luangwa River and Lake Malawi. The southern lacustrine Bantu comprise a whole bunch of peoples in Tanzania, but here in Zambia, those along the rift become a group called the Rukwa Bantu, named after the lake between Tanganyika and Malawi. And the South Congo become the Lunda in the upper Kasai, the Luba in the upper Congo, and Sankuru. Got all that? Good. Let's keep going. Exactly when these groups start breaking up isn't clear, or really an easy question to answer. Pre-modern ethnic identity can be hard to pin down, especially without written records, but we'll say around 1,000 years ago for convenience. The Botatwe become the Lamba in the upper Kafwe, Lenje in the lower, and Tonga everywhere else. The Sabi split into the Lala along the Lunsemfwa, the Bisa in the Luapula, while the Tabwe live along the shores of Lake Tanganyika. Also around this time, for reasons that have been lost to time, Shona migrate and conquer the lower Zambezi, eventually creating a mixed folk called the Sena, while the pure-blood Chewa remain in the upper waters near Lake Malawi. The Rukwa divide into a western group on the Ufipa Plateau, a central group around the Kipengere Mountains, and an eastern along the north shore of Lake Malawi. Fast forward to about 1480, and a group of Chewa forge a kingdom along that lake, probably under influence from Swahili Muslim traders to the east. This becomes the Kingdom of Moravi, reaching as far as the Luangwa River, conquering Sena and Tumbuka clans. And soon, a clan called the Mbunda come from the Angolan highlands and subjugate the Luvale. The former Rukwa peoples continue breaking apart in those isolated valleys and ridges. In Zambia, the Ufipa people become the Mambwe and Lungu, apparently indistinguishable, in the hills of the upper Chembeshi, the Nyamwanga in the Chembeshi swamplands, and the Nyika in the high Luangwa. And can't forget a clan of Tonga becoming a separate people in the Caprivi swamps, the Subia. Also, bear in mind we have Mutapa in the Zimbabwe highlands, and the Portuguese have just made landfall at the Cape of Good Hope. Now, that's a lot of players in this story. But don't worry, there's more. Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama lands at the mouth of the Zambezi in 1498. The name was recorded in 1552, apparently the Mutapa name for the river. There are a couple theories about the origin, one being named after our friends the Bisa, prominent cloth traders in the region. This would be ironic, considering they lived mainly in the watershed of the Congo, not the Zambezi. In any case, speaking of trade, the area of modern-day Zambia held special importance. Here in Zambia, the two great rivers of the Zambezi and Congo meet, linking Central Africa with southern and eastern. This trade route was currently unknown to Europeans, but well traveled by Africans. And along with gold from Zimbabwe, what traveled along this route was another metal Zambia still has in abundance: copper. Chiefs grew wealthy and powerful off the copper trade, used for tools, weapons, and even as currency. And empires rose to control it. Portuguese explorers from the 16th century on wrote accounts of the dynamic Central African states thriving off the riverine trade of the Congo and Zambezi. In 1585, the Luba people are unified in the Upper Congo, and about 1600 the neighboring Lunda kingdom follows. Apparently, some Luba disagreed with this new situation, and migrated away from the kingdom. Some went east to the Luvwa River and became the Hemba, while another group went south to about the Kombopo River, becoming the Kaunde. But Congolese shouldn't have all the fun. The Luyana, also called the Lozi, consolidated control over the neighboring Tonga, Subia, and Kavango clans, creating a loose tribal kingdom. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Lunda have expanded and conquered the Kaunde, while the Portuguese have penetrated as far inland as Zumbo at the juncture of the Zambezi and Luangwa rivers. Here along the Copper Road, Zambezia becomes connected to the wider Indian Ocean, Atlantic, and further trade networks, the Portuguese bringing both Christianity and guns to the Africans. In 1745, a Lunda general named Kanyembo leads a band of his people and conquers the lower Luapula Valley, turning the native Bisa people into a fusion of Lunda culture and Bisa language, becoming the Bemba. By 1760, this rising star conquers the Upper Congo. From here, Kazembe becomes the dominant power along the Copper Road. But the Luba Empire fights back. By 1800, it conquers the Hemba and Kazembe northwest of Lake Mwero, establishing vassal fire kingdoms. Lunda is also on the decline as the Chokwa secede, forcing the neighboring Mbunda to consolidate their clans. The Luyana take advantage of the chaos and conquer the Kaunda. Luba's time on top is short. The death of King Ilunga Sungu enables the Hemba to break away. 1830, the Mbunda invade and occupy portions of the Luyana lands. The early 1800s, as we know, saw the Mfecane in South Africa, the hands of King Shaka and the Zulu. This event created a number of kingdoms in the region. We know Lesotho, Eswatini, Gaza, and Matabele, but another was the Ngoni under their leader, Zwangendaba. By 1835, he settles the southern shore of Lake Malawi and conquers the western portion of Maravi, and apparently even to the northeast. But an unlikely arrival in the Zambezi was a clan of Sutu, the Kololo. Displaced by the Zulu, they flee first to Tswana territory, and then to the Zambezi by about 1830. Their leader, Sebetwane, takes advantage of a succession war amongst the Luyana. By 1845, Sebetwane conquers the Luyana and their vassals, creating a true state that has been called Barotseland. I have used Luyana for the pre-Kololo kingdom, and Lozi for the post, but they are interchangeable. Europeans called this kingdom Barotseland. Remember that in Sutu, Ba is a plural prefix, and similar to Japanese, L and R can bleed together, hence Barotse. King Zwangendaba dies in 1848, and his realm splits into northern loyalist and southern Maseko halves. The Lozi are now the most powerful kingdom in the west, but in the east another player arises. East Africa had long been explored and settled by Arab Muslim traders, and the big items they dealt in were ivory and slaves. The Sultanate of Zanzibar was the primary Arab state in the region and had established many contacts with peoples east of the Great Lakes. One of their allies was a member of the Yeke people named Msiri. He moved into the High Congo as a vassal to King Chinyanta of Kazembe to exploit the Copper Road. In 1860, another slave merchant, the Zanzibari Tipu Tip, led an expedition into the Congo, conquering peoples including the Hemba and becoming Sultan of Utetera. In 1864, the ruling Kololo clan of Lozi were overthrown in a civil war, placed with a native clan, but their language stuck. Following Tipu Tip's example, Msiri traded his copper and ivory for guns, and by 1870 reduces Kazembe to east of the Luapula River. Sultan Tipu Tip and Mwata Msiri control the ivory, slave, and copper trade of the Congo and Zambezi. But European imperialism isn't far behind. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to enter Zambezia, and were long established in Mozambique and Angola by the 19th century. But by then, others, the French, Belgians, and British, were taking an interest in the dark heart of Africa. Effective treatments for tropical diseases and investment opportunities excited Europeans to explore the dark continent. Many of these explorers were Christian missionaries, motivated to spread the gospel amongst the Africans, and ending the slave trade, a practice that had fallen out of fashion in Western Europe, but was still alive amongst the Arabs, Portuguese, and Africans. One was Dr. David Livingstone, who mapped much of the Zambezi, and aroused interest from Europeans with accounts of the copper. Electrical power was a new thing, and what do you know, it needs a certain metal. Cue the scramble for Africa. Africa was an exciting new frontier, and all the great European powers wanted a piece. Unlike in our previous countries, where basically Britain had priority access to southern Africa, here, north of the Zambezi, it was a far more open question. The Berlin Conference outlined zones of control, but stipulated that to formally claim African land, participants had to 1. Conclude treaties with local leaders, and 2. Finalize treaties with neighboring European countries. The race was on. Portugal had been there the longest and claimed a large swath of Zambezia between Angola and Mozambique. The vast and rich Congo Basin was given to King Leopold II of Belgium and his International Association of the Congo. More on that in a later episode. Germany was also approaching from the east towards the Great Lakes. The 1890 treaty between Britain and Germany set the boundary of their zones. In the east, it was the Colombo River, thence along some ridges before going along some straight lines, drawing a more or less straight shot from Lakes Tanganyika to Malawi. In the southwest, it was the Zambezi, then along the line of the Caprivi Strip, Britain's ploy to keep Walvis Bay. Cecil Rhodes and his British South Africa Company had other ideas. They had a grandiose plan to run railroad and telegraph lines from Cape Town all the way to Cairo in Egypt, to bind British Africa together in a new age of technology and imperialism. Portugal's claims stood in the way. The Lord Salisbury's British government wasn't particularly interested in Africa north of the Zambezi, but Scottish missions along Lake Malawi led to clashes with the Portuguese expeditions. Finally, in 1891, Britain issued an ultimatum, forcing the Portuguese to abandon its ambitions. Instead, the BSAC cashed in on its own claims to Zambezia. The borders with Angola weren't fully defined just yet, about to the Kwando River, while those with Mozambique were set with Mashonaland and the future Nyasaland Protectorate. Nyasaland was separated from the BSAC's territory by the watershed divide between Lake Malawi and the rest of the Zambezi. Mozambique was given its little thumb, presumably as a courtesy, because Portugal did have an outpost at Zumbo, so the border was drawn up to the Luangwa River to a point north, thence along a line to the Malawi watershed. We already know the company's land south of the Zambezi became Mashonaland and Matabeleland, the future southern Rhodesia. Those north became northern Rhodesia, but not quite yet. The northern extent was still unclear, but with Portugal and Germany off their backs, the company could focus on making deals with the locals. King of Lozi, Lewanika, had agreed to become a British protectorate in 1890, but Cecil Rhodes technically didn't have the authority. Dissatisfied with this, Lewanika appealed multiple times directly to the British Crown, but the company kept obfuscating his requests. The company did establish a territory between Lozi and the Luangwa River called Northwestern Rhodesia. Meanwhile, northeast, the scramble continued for Masiri's kingdom of Garanganze. It had copper, and both King Leopold and Rhodes really wanted it for their own colonies. Both attempted to make deals. Defiant, Masiri would not accept either. Finally, in 1891, Congo Free State mercenaries shot the king dead. Congo took over Garanganze, known to Europeans as Katanga. In 1894, a treaty fixed the border, a line west from Lake Tanganyika to the head of the Luvwa River, thence up Lake Mweru and the Luapula River to Lake Bangweulu, then down a line to the watershed divide of the Congo and Zambezi basins, and then along the divide due west. The little finger violating Zambia is the Congo pedicle, giving Congo access to the hunting grounds of Bangweulu. This put Kazembe in the BSAC's sphere, but it too refused to kneel. By 1896, the British had defeated the Maseku Ngoni, which are partitioned between Britain and Portugal. In 1899, King Lewanika finally gets what he wants and becomes a British protectorate. Barotseland and Northwest Rhodesia are united into the Protectorate of Barotseland Northwestern Rhodesia. Lewanika becomes a great ally of the British in the region, and even befriends King Edward VII in London. With this, the border between Rhodesia and Angola is set, from a point at the Zambezi-Congo divide, down a series of lines and rivers I wasn't able to find the names of, then down the Niela River to the 13th south latitude, due west to the 22nd east longitude, down to the eastern edge of the Kwando River's floodplain, all the way to the border with German South Africa. The next year, Commissioner Alfred Sharp, in penance for his failure in Katanga, brings King Kantempo X of Kazembe to heel. In 1900, Kazembe and the chiefdoms east of the Lunsemfwa are formally created into the Northeastern Rhodesia Protectorate. Alright, now we have two BSAC protectorates, one mainly Barotseland, the other Kazembe. I read on Wikipedia that the original border between the two was the Kafue until 1907, but I wasn't able to corroborate it with anything, so I just kept it as the later Luangwa, Lunsempwa, and Lukusashi. In either case, the two were merged into Northern Rhodesia, with its capital at Livingston along the Zambezi. The company ruled this territory, like they did in Southern Rhodesia, to generate as much wealth for its shareholders as possible. The mineral wealth that was promised was rather less than was hoped, as richer copper reserves were first found in Belgian Katanga. But the British had the last laugh. It was easier to ship copper south along the new railways. White settlers, however, never really liked corporate government, and soon agitated for political reform. Northern Rhodesians overwhelmingly rejected joining with Southern Rhodesia in 1922. Exactly why I haven't been able to find. They might have expected self-rule for themselves. This never happened, unlike in the South, due to the Devonshire White Paper. More on that during Kenya. But in 1924, the BSAC sold Northern Rhodesia to the British government. In 1935, the capital was moved to a more central location, Lusaka. Northern Rhodesia then became kind of a political oddity. It was formally a protectorate, but functioned like a colony, with a governor and run by the colonial office. Kind of similar to Basutoland, which technically was a colony, but was run by a commissioner and the foreign office, like a protectorate. Anyway, Northern Rhodesia continued to develop as a mining colony. Growth in the worldwide electronics industry and investment from British and American firms opened up more copper deposits for export, and despite market downturn during the Depression, World War II really benefited Northern Rhodesia, as the Allies sourced much of their copper here. Uniting the Rhodesias was always on the mind of certain people, and the concept of federating the two, along with Nyasaland, was brought up. It was postponed by the war, but afterwards, with much of Europe devastated and frankly broke, Britain was looking for ways to save money running their empire. The loss of India by 1950 ushered in decolonization. Western empires led to the intrusion of Western ideas, especially about politics. Black Africans, as fellow human beings, deserved the same rights as whites. Early African leaders, however, soon realized that only lay at the end of a long road of reform, if at all. Too slow. So, an African nationalism emerged. It varied from place to place, but to challenge colonial power, nationalists needed to mobilize the black majority. The problem was there was no one African people. There were literally hundreds of tribes, clans, peoples, languages, nations, kingdoms that composed African society. Some 24 ethnic groups lived in northern Rhodesia alone, many with histories of rivalry and war that Britain had put a stop to. The two biggest, Barotseland and Kazembe, were beneficiaries of British imperialism. Northern Rhodesia also had a very small, maybe 2%, population of whites, but they possessed considerable economic and political power. This incredibly lopsided dynamic upset many African nationalists who wanted to move towards majority rule. Britain's answer to the varied interests of blacks, whites, and their own was to combine the Rhodesias and Nyasaland into the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, also called the Central African Federation, in 1953. It was doomed to failure. Imagined similar to Canada or Australia, it was ruled by a Governor-General, like a British Dominion. However, while the Commonwealth Relations Office was responsible for Southern Rhodesia, the Colonial Office was in charge of Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, and the two secretaries in charge had different ideas about the Federation, and didn't like each other. African nationalists simply saw it as a continuation of white minority rule, because it was, and preferred true independence to this half-baked attempt to preserve Britain's empire in Zambezia. After 10 years, in 1963, the Federation collapsed, its three constituents separating. Both the United States and Soviet Union had put pressure on the old European empires to grant their colonies independence, and no one's heart was really in it anymore. Kenneth Kaunda of the United National Independence Party was elected Prime Minister in 1964, and later that year Britain finally granted Northern Rhodesia independence. Its name was changed to the Republic of Zambia, after the Great River. Kaunda became the first president. and had the task of nation building ahead of him. Forging a national identity out of a multitude of peoples takes a long time. European colonization was very traumatic for many. I get that. A natural response at independence would be a rejection of all European type things that had been imposed on your country. But I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The current of thought in much of Africa back now was a fusion of Soviet-style socialism with African nationalism. Kaunda's regime nationalized industry and became more authoritarian, especially once one-party rule was established in 1972. Kaunda was, however, deft enough to play NATO and the Warsaw Pact off one another, being a member of the non-aligned movement. But as an African nationalist, he offered support for guerrillas in Rhodesia, Southwest Africa, and Mozambique against the vestiges of colonial rule. Despite investments in education, Kaunda's regime mismanaged the economy, and falling prices of copper in the 1970s spelled trouble for Zambia, and soon it took on a huge amount of foreign debt. Limited privatization occurred, but by 1990 it was too late. Widespread protests forced Kaunda to hold free elections, and he lost in 1991. Since then, Zambia has experienced strong economic growth, investment, and a fairly healthy democratic government. Something I'd like to bring to attention is in 2014, President Michael Sata died, succeeded by his vice president, Guy Scott. Scott is, in fact, a white Zambian, a legacy of northern Rhodesia. What this means to me is at least Zambia is willing to transition from a post-colonial era to a new Africa era, one that embraces all Africans, of all colors, to build a better continent. After the trials and tribulations of colonization and apartheid, that is encouraging. And I would say Zambia is looking a fair deal better than its southern neighbor, Zimbabwe. Next time, we'll go east to Zambia's long and thin neighbor, Malawi. See you then.